You've heard of bows and arrows, but what if I told you the longbow and crossbow weren't just primitive sticks with string? One turned peasants into elite warriors, while the other could punch straight through a knight's armor. Which one was the real game changer on medieval battlefields? Let's bust the biggest myths and see which weapon actually changed history, and how they both did it in completely different ways. Let's talk about how most people completely miss the point with medieval weapons. At some point, every movie, game, or even a dusty old textbook got you thinking that bows in the Middle Ages were about as complex as a toy from the dollar store. You picture a guy with a stick and a string, sort of pulling back, aiming vaguely in the air, and then flop, an arrow dribbles out, maybe bounces off a tin can, cartoon sound effects and all. But that's about as close to reality as using a butter knife in a sword fight. There's this classic mix-up that still shows up everywhere. A bow is a bow is a bow, right? No, not even close. It's like looking at a Ferrari and a John Deere tractor and saying, hey, they both have 4 wheels and an engine, so they must work the same. The magic is in the details, and in medieval times, those details could mean the difference between life and death. Pop culture especially loves to jumble this stuff up. Watch a movie where an actor picks up a longbow and casually fires off a perfect shot while chatting about last night's dinner. Or how about every RPG game that lets your knight swap between a longbow and a crossbow, just as if they're choosing between Coke and Pepsi? None of this gets at what made these weapons actually scary to anyone who had to face them. The truth is, the longbow and the crossbow were powerful for totally opposite reasons. Each one was designed for a completely different job, and the skills needed to use them couldn't have been more different. It's a bit like watching someone try to drag race a dump truck or plow a field with a race car. Sure, they both move, but try using the wrong tool for the job, and you'll see how quickly things get ugly. Let's talk about how these mix-ups cause real confusion, even when experts should know better. It's not just a case of Hollywood making things up for laughs. Take the infamous scene from Braveheart. William Wallace leads the charge, arrows fly, and it doesn't matter if the archers are using longbows, shortbows, or odd half-sized sticks. The difference blurs, so the audience forgets that one of these things took over a decade to master, and the other could be fired by a cranky townsperson after a week of practice. And it's not just movies. Turn to a surprising number of textbooks, and you'll see drawings where a medieval archer is holding something that looks more like a warped popsicle stick than a weapon designed to break armies. This kind of mix-up isn't harmless. It makes people think that technology stood still for hundreds of years, as if nothing got smarter until someone invented the musket. Even smart people can get this wrong. Historians sometimes focus on who killed whom, and forget to explain why one group had such a huge edge. Imagine if you wrote a history of Formula 1 racing and forgot to mention that, oh, by the way, some cars had 4 times the horsepower. Or if you said baseball and cricket were basically the same, because both use bats and balls. The small stuff, like what it actually took to pull a longbow or to load a heavy crossbow under fire, makes all the difference. You can't just toss around the word bow and expect people to understand why entire civil wars and invasions turned on who could shoot faster or punch through thicker armor. If you ever sat through a school project on the Middle Ages, you probably heard the whole story in 2 sentences. Knights got shot by arrows, peasants armed with whatever they could find, the end. Except, let's pause on that peasant part, because with a longbow, calling someone a peasant is really underselling it. To even draw one of those monsters, you needed to start training as a little kid. Think years of hauling back massive weights until your spine freaked out. Testing old skeletons, archaeologists have found that the bones in longbowmen's arms and shoulders actually warped from decades of drawing back 80 to 120 pounds over and over. These weren't regular farmers on their day off. They turned into living siege weapons, with muscles and bones shaped like something out of a superhero comic. Only nobody was handing out capes. Now, with the crossbow, you've got a totally different story. Crossbows were a game changer, because almost anyone strong enough to turn a handle could fire one. It was the medieval version of a point-and-click adventure. No lifelong training. No years of torturing your bones and joints. A soldier, or even a civilian drafted into battle, could become deadly with just a crash course, sometimes in less than a week. This isn't an exaggeration. Some armies gave out crossbows to people who'd never seen battle before, and those soldiers scored hits against armored knights on their first try. It was like handing power tools to anyone with opposable thumbs. This made crossbows so effective that by the late 12th century, some authorities were panicking. Want some numbers to put things in perspective? Historians think it took at least 10 years of constant practice to become competent with a longbow. That's right, 10 whole years, on top of any other job or survival skills you needed as a medieval kid. Meanwhile, a crossbow could be taught to a recruit in as little as a few days, with training programs more like a modern safety demo than boot camp. Imagine how much that changes the math for armies. Millions of hours spent making just a few archers versus churning out squads of instant crossbowmen overnight. The difference in training meant each weapon shaped the battlefield in totally unique ways. Longbows painted the sky with rainstorms of arrows, clouds so thick that some battles were decided by sheer panic and confusion as much as injury. Crossbows, on the other hand, changed who could win a fight. Give a crossbow to the wrong person, and suddenly the balance of power flipped. That wasn't just scary for enemy commanders. It was terrifying for society itself. The Pope even tried to ban the use of crossbows on Christians, calling it a tool hateful to God, because it broke the rules of knightly combat and made armored nobles just as vulnerable as any poor foot soldier. These misunderstandings stick with us, because nobody wants to believe that medieval people built high-tech weapons the way we think about gadgets or machines today. It feels good to imagine the past as simple, full of grunting guys slinging rocks and sticks. But the real winners on medieval battlefields were the ones who understood every trick of their tools, the magic of speed, or the crushing power of mechanical force. Both the longbow and the crossbow were cutting-edge technology, pushed to the limit by people who wanted every possible edge on the battlefield. So, next time you fire up a game or catch a show with medieval archers and crossbowmen, remember, these weren't just bows. They were tools so advanced that leaders and even whole countries obsessed over them. Owning and mastering the right weapon could change the course of a battle, rewrite the rules of who got to rule, and even force new laws about who could fight. If you want to see the longbow in its prime, let's break down what made it the medieval version of a machine gun. Only you needed the body of a linebacker and the training discipline of a marathon runner. Let's talk about the longbow, because this thing was no ordinary stick you'd find at summer camp. It was the medieval version of a machine gun, mostly because it could spit out arrows at an insane rate, but with a catch that no one in their right mind would call user-friendly. Imagine trying to pull a giant springboard back with nothing but your arms, and not just once or twice, but again and again, hundreds of times, every single day. Drawing a true English longbow meant handling between 80 and 180 pounds of pull. Most people today would need both hands and a fair bit of luck just to get the string behind their ear once. Picture this. The average gym-goer today picks up a 100-pound weight and gets a round of applause. English archers did that with every shot, and they weren't just lifting it, they were flexing, aiming, and firing, all while chaos broke loose around them. Trying to string a real war bow was like arm wrestling against a brick wall, and losing for the first 10 years. Most people couldn't even get the string onto the bow, let alone hold it steady and shoot. There's a reason the phrase, born for the bow, made sense in England. Nobody just picked one of these up as an adult. To become one of those legendary archers, kids had to start young. Think 5 or 6 years old, in the backyard. Or, well, muddy village field, pulling back homemade bows that got heavier and heavier each year. There were actual laws on the books forcing boys to practice archery. Missing your session was like skipping school, except your parents and the local sheriff both wanted you to keep up. That wasn't about good posture or hobbies. It was about survival and national pride. By the time these kids were grown, their bodies changed in weird ways from the training. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks, like the Mary Rose, shows just how much this weapon reshaped people. Skeletons from longbowmen have left forearms thicker than their sword-hand arms and elbows that look like they've been remodeled by a clumsy carpenter. Some even show scoliosis and other spine issues from years of drawing back the string, with thickened left forearms and elbows and spinal deformities, indicating the strain of repeated use. These were not ordinary medieval folks you'd meet in a tavern. By the time they reached adulthood, they looked like they'd spent their whole lives powerlifting and then tried Pilates for good measure. Now ask yourself, why go through all that pain and misery just to fling arrows around? Because when a group of English archers stood together on the battlefield, they became the closest thing to a machine gun nest that the 1300s ever saw. In big fights like Agincourt, archers unleashed clouds of arrows, so thick they literally blocked out the sky. There are stories from French knights who describe waves of arrows raining down so fast that men couldn't see the sun. Once the command was given, arrows filled the air. One account calls it a storm of wooden death. It wasn't just about killing enemies. The panic and confusion from all those missiles could break up an army before hand-to-hand combat even started. And let's talk about speed. A trained longbowman could fire between 10 and 12 arrows every single minute. That doesn't sound wild until you try it yourself. Most modern archers wear wrist guards and special gloves to take a shot every few seconds. Ex-soldiers and historians who've tried it say that after a dozen war arrows, your fingers go numb and your back aches for hours. Medieval archers just shrugged and kept firing, sometimes for hours at a stretch. No time wasted on fancy gadgets or laborious reloading. Just notch, draw, and release. Rapid fire, over and over. At Agincourt, it's said that thousands of arrows flew every second. If an army had 5,000 archers, you were facing a wall of 60,000 arrows in one terrifying minute. This is what put English longbowmen on a whole other level. They weren't just local farmers. They were created through years of hard labor and sheer stubbornness. The government knew what it was doing. By ordering regular archery practice, they weren't just building a national hobby. They were creating a generation of living weapons, each soldier as valuable as an entire squad with other gear. It didn't matter if you grew up rich or poor. If you could draw that bow, you joined a club of elite warriors, respected by friends and absolutely hated by enemies. But here's the real winner. Not only did the longbow fire fast, it had serious range. Some arrows could reach up to 400 yards if the wind was right, but in combat, 200 yards was the sweet spot, still more than enough to rain pain on an entire field before the enemy even closed the distance. Imagine being a knight in a shining suit and spotting 100 archers setting up across the field. You'd hear the order, and then suddenly splinters tear through the air faster than your horse can run. And don't think armor saved you from everything. Bodkin-tipped arrows could pierce mail, especially at close range, and a well-trained archer could aim for weak points. The longbow, though, came with downsides. All that power and skill meant it was never plug and play. No shortcuts for last-minute recruits, no way to grab one from the armory and become a Black Ops soldier by next week. And because it needed so much training, longbowmen were a rare breed. Their bones gave them away in death, as much as their arrows did in life. As the saying went, one reason for hostility to the bow was precisely its effectiveness, especially from a distance. Nobles could be killed by low-class archers, without even an opportunity for retaliation. Getting killed by a random arrow shot from a faceless archer felt unfair to many nobles, which explains why you rarely find ballads celebrating the guy with the bow. Robin Hood became a legend mostly because being a famous archer was a little bit rebellious and a little bit dangerous. British longbows used yew wood, sometimes ash or elm. They were about 6 feet tall, roughly the same size as the people shooting them. The secret was combining the tough sapwood on the outside with the springy heartwood inside. Every bow was handmade, carefully seasoned and shaped, so the archer could count on the same draw weight every time. None of this came from a medieval version of bows RUS. Each one was matched to the man who shot it, almost like a custom suit that could kill. If there's one weapon that really gave the powers that be nightmares in medieval Europe, it was the crossbow. You might think it doesn't look very impressive at first. Just a short, thick bow stuck sideways on a wooden stock. But what made the crossbow terrifying wasn't how it looked, but what it could do and who could use it. Compared to the years of muscle building and bone bending it took to become a longbowman, the crossbow was like suddenly switching medieval warfare over to easy mode. Pretty much anyone with working arms, or even just decent leg muscles, could get one, load it, and pull the trigger. The big difference here, kings and the Pope actually got worried that just about anyone could be turned into a deadly shot almost overnight. This was the first point-and-shoot weapon that people could use with almost zero fancy training. You didn't have to spend your childhood hauling back 100 pounds of yew wood. All you had to do was slot a short, thick bolt into the groove, pull back the string with a mechanical gadget, and listen for the satisfying click of a weapon ready to fire. Crossbows had stocks like a gun, and devices like the windlass or cranquin. Imagine a can opener and a winch had a baby, so regular people could pull back strings that even bodybuilders would struggle with. The science behind it was simple enough. Use a crank, have a much higher draw weight than a longbow, and let the machine do most of the work. Soldiers could hit targets up to 200 yards away using bolts that flew so hard they punched through knightly armor like it was a can of soda in the wrong place at the wrong time. Knights with all their expensive gear went from invincible to very worried the first time a crossbow squad lined up opposite them. Now, the magic of the crossbow wasn't in how it fired, slower than a longbow for sure, but in how anyone could use it. Imagine a farmer, someone whose biggest fight last month was maybe with a pushy goat, getting shoved into the local lord's militia. Hand him a crossbow and a few hours of practice. Suddenly, he's got about as much stopping power against a mounted knight as the pro soldiers do. A heavy crossbow could send a bolt whipping through mail, and even into plate armor if you aimed at the right spots. You can see why the ruling classes began to sweat. Mass-produced killing power meant you could put together a squad of instant archers, no special background required. Recent studies show that an untrained peasant could be given a crossbow and taught how to use it effectively very quickly. That shook up the whole idea of who should win battles, or even who should rule. All those speedy mechanics came with a trade-off, though. The downside, reloading a crossbow wasn't quick. The most powerful ones needed serious gadgets to wind up. You'd plant the front end on the ground, maybe step into a stirrup, attach a crank or cranquin, and heave away for for several seconds just to get it set to fire. While longbowmen could rattle off 10 or 12 arrows a minute, crossbowmen usually got off about 2 or 3 bolts if they were working fast. But for certain jobs, rate of fire didn't matter, especially if you could keep the weapon loaded and ready for the perfect shot and duck behind cover for safety. A crossbowman behind a castle wall or a pavis shield wasn't worried about hand cramps. He'd wait, watch for a knight's weak spot, and let fly with a single shot that could ruin a lord's entire day. This is where the crossbow really started causing social problems. Unlike the longbow, which needed a special kind of person, the crossbow took away a lot of barriers. If you could wind the string, you could win the duel. Suddenly, anyone could take down a shining suit of armor. The armored nobility, who liked to believe they were basically medieval superheroes, now had something new to fear: random foot soldiers. And they weren't alone in feeling unsettled. Church authorities sat up and paid attention, too. Tensions boiled over so much that the Pope himself called a special meeting about it. Jump to 1139, when the Second Lateran Council had enough of what they called the device. The Catholic Church actually wrote, in an official record, that the crossbow was unfit for use by Christians, and said anyone who shot one at another Christian would face penalty of an anathema. Basically, the Pope was banning the crossbow for anything except fighting infidels and heretics. In plain speak, saying the weapon was fine if you used it on enemies of the faith, but crossbows pointed at your fellow Christians? That was against God. Why? Because deadly force had just become available to peasants, townies, and anyone with the arm strength to wind the crank. The church wasn't just worried about violence, they were terrified of the social chaos this weapon could spark. The ban itself wasn't just about being squeamish, it was about fear. Nobles who'd spent years buying armor, training on horseback, and fighting for social status now had to worry their next duel might end with a farmer taking a lucky shot from behind a haystack. This kind of leveling power meant any social climber could become a threat, and not just on the battlefield. The ban even called the crossbow a tool hateful to God. The church sensed that if crossbows kept spreading old-school feudal power built on knights, codes of chivalry, and all those fancy tournaments, could unravel fast. But here's the kicker. Try telling an army that a weapon is too effective and see what happens. Instead of throwing away crossbows, commanders wanted more of them, and so did the people defending castles. The crossbow became the weapon of choice behind thick fortress walls, or in towns where surprise attacks were common. In fact, Genoese crossbowmen got so famous for their skills that kings and princes across Europe hired them out as mercenary squads. These guys didn't just show up with their own kits, they often brought whole teams with them. Some crossbowmen had assistants called crossbow loaders, whose entire job was to wind up the bows so the shooter could keep firing. The Genoese actually became known for needing 2 or 3 people per crossbow team, one firing, one reloading, and sometimes another carrying big shields. There were good reasons for going to all that trouble. A lone crossbowman worked best when he wasn't under direct attack. Put him in a castle tower or behind a massive pavis shield, and he could take his time aiming and turning the crank. Armies soon figured out that you could create bolt storms at the start of a battle if a line of crossbowmen all fired preloaded shots in the first minute. There's even evidence of some crossbows being so heavy that they left the weapon cocked and ready for hours, just waiting for the critical moment to let a bolt fly. And while it was slower than a longbow, the piercing attack made it deadly for both cavalry and anyone who forgot their armor at home. Not only did the crossbow make warfare more affordable, it made it unpredictable. The power of the crossbow literally democratized violence for the first time in centuries. It's no wonder kings and church leaders wanted to put the genie back in the bottle. This weapon let armies hire fresh recruits and have them threatening the best opponents in less than a week. The long training pipeline of the longbow felt almost ridiculous by comparison. But all this brings up the big question. If crossbows were so easy to use and so deadly, why didn't they completely replace the longbow? Wouldn't it make sense for every army to just hand out crossbows and skip all that training and expense? Turns out, speed is a different kind of weapon, and sometimes being fast can shape who actually survives when the arrows and bolts start flying. If the crossbow was such a beast on the battlefield, why didn't it send the longbow packing? It all comes back to speed versus power. Imagine you're looking down a battlefield. On one side, teams of crossbowmen, slow, steady, waiting for that huge thunk as each bolt flies out. On the other, longbowmen in rough linen shirts, barely breathing between shots, loosing one arrow after another until it feels like the air itself is raining wood. On paper, it seems obvious. The crossbow could punch straight through armor, so why even bother with those stickbenders and their endless practice routines? Turns out, when arrows start flying, the slow and steady sometimes get trampled by the fast and relentless. That single thunderous crossbow bolt might send a knight rolling off his horse. But the longbow's magic was making the enemy look up, panic, and see a whole sky full of arrows heading their way. Let's set the scene muddy and glorious. Soldiers slogging it out, crossbowmen huddling behind big wooden pavis shields like mobile walls, taking their time with each careful shot. Opposite them, a line of English longbowmen launch wave after wave of arrows, barely pausing to wipe the sweat out of their eyes. You can almost hear the rhythm. Twang, twang, twang. Each arrow, a piece of the larger machine. The crossbowman, probably praying the enemy doesn't close the distance too fast, whines as Crank breathes, and waits for just that right moment. It's a good life if you have walls or a shield in front of you. Not so great if you have a charge coming straight at your face. The real challenge was that each weapon's strengths made it bad at other things. The longbow was all about that rain of arrows. A trained archer could shoot 10 to 12 shots every minute. Some sources say 6 arrows per minute under battle conditions, but even at that pace, you're firing more in 10 minutes than most crossbowmen would manage in half an hour. That's overwhelming, panic-inducing for the people on the receiving end. But there's a catch. Training a single longbowman took a chunk of a lifetime. English laws actually required boys to practice archery for years. If you wanted an army of archers, you had to plan ahead a generation. Now, the crossbow was the shortcut. The big upside was that it could be handed out to almost anyone, and after a quick demo, they could use it well enough. The downside, reloading was a pain. There's a whole performance for every bolt. Step into the stirrup, wind the mechanism, load the bolt, double-check you don't shoot your own foot, and only then do you get to pull the trigger. A trained crossbowman could maybe fire 2 or 3 bolts in a minute if he was really moving. If your hands were cold or wet, or if you lost your crank, your job instantly got a lot harder. But numbers alone don't tell the whole story. The real test came in places like the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where the difference wasn't just in weapons, but in organization and luck. Picture this. French commanders call in the famous Genoese crossbowmen, who march out with their tall shields, ready to open the battle. English archers set up on high ground, fresh and able to reach for their arrows right away. The day is rainy, mud everywhere. The Genoese try to keep their strings dry, but the English bowstrings, kept safely under their hats or inside their jackets, come out in perfect shape. When the order comes, the longbowmen don't waste a second. 6 arrows a minute, multiplied by thousands of archers, fill the sky before the crossbowmen can even finish winding up. English longbowmen, positioned on elevated ground, decimated the French forces, particularly the Genoese crossbowmen, who were outmaneuvered and outshot before they could effectively engage. The crossbow's power didn't save them. They had the shields, but with so many arrows arcing overhead, cover only worked for so long. But give the crossbow a different job, and the story changes. Drop the crossbowman behind a castle wall during a siege, and that slow reload becomes less of a problem. There's no need to fire as fast as you can if you have cover and time on your side. Here, the crossbow's ability to penetrate armor made it a formidable weapon, allowing defenders to target attackers from a distance. When the enemy has to cross a moat, climb a wall, or get past layers of defenses, the crossbow's accuracy and hitting power give it the edge. Sometimes, it wasn't even about the actual battle. Just the threat of being picked off from the ramparts by a hidden crossbowman could freeze an attack in its tracks. Tactics kept changing to answer these strengths and weaknesses. Longbowmen took over open fields and wide, flat spaces, any place where they could line up and hit enemies from hundreds of yards away. Nobody wanted to see the hail of arrows coming their way. In tight streets, castle towers, or thick forests, crossbowmen set up where even a small squad could block in advance. When knights turned to heavier armor, hoping to block arrows, crossbow makers answered with stouter bolts and stronger mechanisms. It was an arms race, with each side always one step away from finding their next advantage. There's no better example of all this than the way the battle lines shifted during the 100 Years' War. At Agincourt, the English archers targeted the horses of the French knights, with their arrows causing chaos before anyone could reach them. Over and over, longbowmen shaped open battles to their side's advantage. But the story flips when the setting changes. Crossbows dominated sieges, where nobody cares how fast you fire as long as your bolt gets through chainmail. Even in the famous Battle of Crécy, it's not just about who had the best weapon, but who used it in the best way. The Genoese crossbowmen got caught out of their element. No time to reload, no way to keep up with the longbow's rhythm, and no chance to recover once panic spread. In the wrong terrain, and with the wrong preparation, even the mightiest weapon falls flat. So, why didn't one simply replace the other? Because neither weapon did everything perfectly. Longbows were unbeatable for raw shooting speed, and for filling the battlefield with missiles. Crossbows could make anyone dangerous, and their bolts owned the world of siege warfare. Every time weapon makers and armorsmiths came up with something new, the other side fired back, literally and figuratively. This competition kept both weapons on the front lines for centuries, each one finding the exact moments and places where it made the most sense. The longbow put power in the hands of a dedicated few, but for sieges, city fighting, and sudden bursts of precision force, the crossbow was the answer. And there's the twist. The real story is not about which weapon was best, but how their competition shaped medieval armies. Let's talk about what happened when entire countries had to rethink who their soldiers were, and how these weapons rewrote the social order just as much as the rules of war. Think medieval weapons were just clunky blocks of wood and rusty metal? If you grabbed a real war longbow or crossbow and put it in the hands of a modern engineer, you'd probably get some raised eyebrows. And then excuses about sore elbows. Let's take apart what's really going on under the hood. The longbow, for starters, is way more than a big stick and some twine. The best ones were crafted mostly from yew wood, a material so prized that entire forests were managed just to keep up with demand. But this wasn't any old bit of yew tossed into a fire. Bow makers dried the wood for a year, sometimes 2, before getting near it with a tool. And even then, building a bow that worked for war could take 3 or even 4 years of careful workshops and worrying over whether you'd chosen the right branch. The secret to the longbow's crazy power came from the way its wood was used. Makers would line up the bow with the sapwood on the outside, where the pull has to stretch, and the heartwood on the inside to handle the compression. The end result was what one modern builder called a natural laminate, but this was happening centuries before fancy glue or carbon fiber. The bow would have that classic D-shape in cross-section, a kind of biological engineering, where you could almost see the tree's growth rings guiding every shot. If you really want to get technical, it's basically the medieval version of a single-purpose race car. Lightweight, engineered for maximum speed and distance. But get one number wrong, on the wood's age, shape, or curve, and you'd be better off throwing rocks. The best bows were roughly as tall as the archer, sometimes up to 6 feet, so you got the longest draw and the most stored power with every pull. The whole process demanded patience. Each piece was shaped, whittled, and tested little by little, almost like tuning an instrument. Compare that to the crossbow, which is basically the heavy truck in this race. The crossbow isn't about speed, it's pure mechanical muscle. The frame, called the stock, was fitted with a prod, the horizontal bow part, mounted across the end. At first, prods were made of wood or horn, but by the later medieval period, steel became the material of choice for real battlefield versions. Steel prods packed immense force, but needed even more muscle to operate, so that's where gadgets come in. Need to draw back a string attached to a 300-pound prod? There's no arm day at the gym that prepares you for that. Instead, crossbows use things like the stirrup, plant your foot, and pull with both hands, or windlasses and crannikins to slowly ratchet back that string. To put it simply, the crossbow was using levers and gears almost 1,000 years before anyone thought up the Industrial Revolution. Now, if the longbow is a race car, quick, light, but only if you're a train driver, the crossbow is that turbocharged semi on a hill. The top speed may be lower, but one hit could take the roof straight off anything in its lane. While one person might fire more arrows, a loaded crossbow was always lurking with one big, armor-punching shot. And the wild part, crossbows didn't just use basic triggers. Some even had safety catches and mechanisms to keep the string locked until you decided to shoot. You could keep a crossbow loaded and ready for hours, all while hiding out behind a wall with barely any effort. Try holding a longbow at full draw for more than a couple seconds. Your arms will give out way before your enemy does. Speaking of getting things just right, both weapons needed their own special ammo to finish the job. Medieval arrows weren't just hand-whittled sticks. For the longbow, war arrows came in types like the bodkin point, a narrow, hard tip, made for piercing mail armor, or the broadhead, which was basically what you'd pick for hunting or causing maximum bleeding. Arrowheads were hammered by blacksmiths, hardened with fire, and designed to punch through whatever armor the other team had invested in that year. The crossbow used quarrels, also called bolts, which were typically shorter and heavier than regular arrows. You'd find bolts tipped with iron, steel, or even forged into special shapes for punching through chainmail and plate. The difference in size and design mattered. A quarrel could hit harder and was less likely to snap, while the best arrows stretched the range out to the edge of what a sharp eye could manage. But making the perfect arrow or bolt was its own rabbit hole. Craftsmen would pair certain arrows to certain bows, taking into account not only the size and weight, but how straight the shaft was, and even what kind of feathers were used. Crossbow bolts, being chunkier, could afford to be a little less fussy, but select armies still had blacksmiths pumping out custom points for every different campaign. In fact, when archaeologists dig up medieval battle sites, the variety in arrow and bolt heads tells a story of constant weapons testing, not old-timey sameness. Let's not forget about what these weapons could actually do. A longbow with the right arrow could reach out 200 yards, or even farther if you just wanted to scare the enemy rather than aim. Crossbows were a bit shorter on range, but the payoff was in the punch. With high draw weights, up to 300 pounds, crossbows could penetrate male body armor at close range and laugh off protection that would stop most arrows cold. That made them perfect for castle sieges, when you needed one good hit from behind the battlements or wanted to scare knights out of their saddles. Here's another engineering trick. Crossbows solved the firing from cover problem long before anyone invented the sniper scope. With no need to stand tall and draw, you could crouch behind a thick wooden wall or a stone parapet, poke just the nose of the weapon out, and take your time. The locking device meant the crossbow stayed loaded until the perfect moment. In a siege, this was gold. You could wait for someone to peek over a wall and let the bolt fly, all while staying almost completely hidden. The longbow, needing both arms and a broad stance, wasn't exactly made for sneaky moves. And we haven't even mentioned the dedication behind making these marvels. Bowyers and fletchers often spent their whole lives mastering just one part of the craft. If you think assembly lines only came with cars, think again. Medieval arrow production had entire workshops for just straightening shafts or shaping heads. Crossbow makers became specialists too, working out how to forge tiny yet sturdy steel prods and carve stock strong enough to handle massive tension without splintering under pressure. Some historians even argue these craftsmen were the medieval version of tech startup founders, always tweaking designs, pushing for more range or more stopping power. The magic of the longbow and crossbow lives in those details, the result of generations of trial, error, and obsession with perfection. Every tweak, from the type of wood to the shape of the trigger or size of a quarrel, was another step in a centuries-long arms race. Nobody was building cookie-cutter weapons and calling it good enough, getting a real war bow off the ground, or making a crossbow that didn't snap with the first pull. Wasn't just a technical challenge. It was craftsmanship with consequences. Armies wanted the best edge, and nations sometimes relied on these weapons to tip the balance for a whole generation. The shape of a bow or a new mechanism in a crossbow could decide whether your side won or lost battles. The next time you see a medieval weapon in a movie and think it looks rough, remember, a lot of the tech you'd find inside would actually impress a room full of engineers today. Some tricks, like safety locks on crossbows or the natural laminate in longbows, would fit right in at a modern workshop. These weapons weren't just fighting tools. They were testaments to what happens when people pour their lives into making something that can change history. But weapons alone don't win wars. Someone has to wield them. Now, let's see what happened when armies filled with these new tools started to change, not just battlefields, but the people holding the strings and cranks. Let's talk about the people who actually pulled the strings. Literally and figuratively. The story of the longbow and the crossbow is way more than just pointy things flying through the air. It's about who held the power and who lost sleep over it. There were two different kinds of shooters on the field, and each had their own spot on the medieval food chain. English longbowmen popped up everywhere in stories as tough, almost legendary heroes, but what's not as obvious is how they got there, or why they mattered so much. These were men pulled from the yeomanry class, not lords but not your average field hand either. Their social status wasn't equal to knights, but they were miles ahead of the poor spearmen who got eaten for breakfast in most battles. Their role on the field translated into better pay and respect, even if they didn't reach the upper echelons of society. The funny part is, nobody was handed the job at birth. Longbow training started early and wasn't optional. Imagine growing up with Sunday afternoons spent at the town archery range, your whole village watching and your dad reminding you the king would be unhappy if you skipped practice. This wasn't an honor system. Under the law of 1252, men had to attend longbow training every Sunday, and if you slacked off, there might be a fine or worse. It was the medieval version of compulsory P mixed with national defense, and it stuck because it worked. By the time they reached the battlefield, longbowmen were sort of like the Marines, proud, feared, physically tough, and separate from the rank and file. That required a lifetime of discipline. These weren't the sort of guys who'd show up late or drop a bow in the dirt. It was a small club, and if you made it, there were perks. Better food on campaign, higher odds you'd survive an actual fight, and a place in the stories your grandkids would hear. Whole towns prided themselves on their archers, and some even kept records of which families produced the best shots each year. But that pride came at a serious cost. Training warped their bodies for life, and a longbowman who made it to old age might have the scars on his hands and shoulders to prove it. On the other side, you had the crossbow crowd, and they brought a different energy to the field. The beauty of the crossbow was how it smashed the rules on who got to fight and win. Nobles grumbled, but suddenly, the crossbow was easier to master, requiring less physical strength and training. That's not just an engineering trick. It's a social reset button. You didn't have to build a super soldier from age 5. If you had 2 working arms, or sometimes just strong legs and patience with a crank, you could learn to put a bolt through plate armor by next week. The range of crossbow users was almost absurd. Mercenaries by the truckload, recruited from across borders, and even rebels, townsfolk, or women defending a city during siege. Armies in France loved to pack their ranks with Genoese crossbowmen, entire crews of paid professionals who hauled their equipment in on wagons. These guys came with not just weapons, but a small army of helpers. One to hold the Pavis shield, one to reload, and sometimes another just to shout warnings when the enemy got too close. While the longbow built up a core of homegrown heroes, the crossbow spread power to anyone angry or brave enough to take a shot. Leaders paid crossbowmen well, but didn't give them honorary feasts or a place in high society. Crossbowmen were mercenaries or outsiders, and that made them both useful and slightly suspicious. They could switch sides if the pay was right, or simply disappear once the battle ended. You wanted them for their professional skills, not their family tree. Now here's where things get uncomfortable for the powers that be. The sheer accessibility of the crossbow made the elite nervous. Anyone could use it, from peasants, women, even criminals, and that turned the social order sideways. The old vision, knights in shining armor, ruling from horseback, untouchable by regular men, started to wobble hard. This ease of use led to the crossbow being viewed with suspicion by the ruling classes, who saw it as a weapon that could disrupt the traditional hierarchy. If the king couldn't control who got to be deadly, how could he keep control of the kingdom? The Pope himself showed up to answer that, banning the crossbow for use against Christians because it was a tool of excessive brutality. If you needed a sign that the weapon was changing everything, look at church law. They weren't afraid of swords, but they were afraid of a crank and trigger. On the battlefield, this showdown between rare, trained archers and instant crossbowmen forced everyone to get smart or die trying. English armies leaned into the longbowman myth, planning whole strategies around rainstorms of arrows. They added tricks like planting sharpened stakes in front of their archers to stop cavalry from charging, turning open fields into no-go zones for mounted knights. Crossbow teams had their own answers, setting up behind wooden Pavis shields and working in waves so one row could reload while the other fired. In the crowded chaos of a siege, the crossbow remained a popular weapon, particularly in defensive situations, because defenders could hide behind walls and fire from safety. Tactics had to change fast. Some armies built mixed formations, pairing the rapid fire of longbowmen with the heavy punch of crossbow bolts. And you'd see both sides adding layers of sneaky defense. Archers aiming at horses to topple knights before they got close, crossbowmen waiting for weak points in armor, always looking for that one shot that could end a commander's career in a heartbeat. It was chess with deadly pieces, each one with just enough tricks to outsmart the other, at least for a while. The weapons also carried a price. As longbowmen became more important, their pay went up and their status crept higher. The rising pay, changing status, and the slow fade of the armored knight were all part of the same shift. Whole classes of society started to change, but that new power sometimes led to old rules snapping under the pressure. Crossbows in the hands of rebels or common townsfolk fueled more than a few famous revolts. Suddenly, city guilds or angry villagers could stand up to the people in fancy armor, sometimes for the first time in living memory. By the late 1400s and into the 1500s, all those rules were coming apart anyway. Gunpowder weapons started to show up, and both the longbow and crossbow were already vanishing. Not because they failed, but because someone found a new way to kill at a distance. But before they faded, these weapons had already made their mark, not just shaping tactics, but carving out whole new rules about who got to fight, who could win, and where the real power lived. When the last volleys were fired, whole countries looked different. The real magic of the longbow and crossbow isn't just who shot them, but how they rewrote the game. They didn't just win battles, they flipped the script on who the winners could be, and who the old world left behind. Which brings us to the point. What actually matters about these weapons, now that we know who held them, and why the old guard shook in their boots? The longbow and crossbow were never just oversized toys. They changed the entire way people fought, and won wars. The longbow and crossbow, far from being simple or interchangeable, were sophisticated weapons that redefined medieval warfare, making it both more strategic and more lethal. Every shot, whether a flurry of arrows or a single clanking bolt, was proof that these were real tools of power, not background props. So next time you spot a random archer or crossbowman in a show, remember they stand for centuries of innovation and street-smart tactics. Which would you want on your side, speed or power? Let us know below.